out of a secret U.S. space program, or let's not even call it space, let's call it hyperdimensional technology, because it's beyond space and time. And there's a lot of evidence to support the idea that the anti-gravitics is about 50 or 60 years ahead of where we are in the civilian level. So, I mean, I actually, float around triangles is something I've observed.
Yeah, I've actually seen UFOs myself, very close and personal. That's what made me a believer.
Yeah, exactly. And it was one of those things where it's like, okay, it's sitting up over my head. I can see that those trees are, and I know trees, I live here in the Northwest. The trees, they're 130 to 180 feet high. And that thing is, it's casting light down, blah, blah, blah. It's the middle of the night. And oh, by the way, it looks to be about a mile across, and there's no sound coming from it. And then it goes zip and it's gone. So I kind of suspect that we've got a dual society going on here. That part of our society, led by the shadow government, is sucking resources from the rest of us, bleeding us all as slaves, while they are building their way towards a Type 1 civilization, which is to say interplanetary and sustainable energy, free energy, that kind of thing. And the rest of us are just being excluded because of the feudal nature of the social order that we've never yet thrown off. And I say that we've never yet thrown it off, and it'll probably offend all you Canadians, but I think that the Queen and everybody who claims aristocracy should be made to stand in front of a video and recant that and go about living as an ordinary human and be re-educated and allowed to do something useful for society, or killed. And I'm not a person that really thinks that killing is a solution. But from our viewpoint now, it's horrific to say, but I understand why they killed the Tsar's family in the Bolshevik Revolution.
Yeah.
And it had little to do with fear of an immediacy from them, but a fear of a resurgence of the monarchy later on, which gets us all back into being trapped in the idea that these people have somehow got the divine right to rule, such that badly dressed woman and her foul-mouthed husband in England claim to own 1/6 of the planet and all the people that live on it.
Hey, Clif.
Yeah.
I'm seeing over and over here, Israeli mistake.
Sure, the Israeli mistake. Right now you see the shift in language if you look into the media globally and you're looking at the mainstream press and even some of the alternatives. You're seeing that we're crawling towards some kind of a conclusion. My conclusion is that the Israeli mistake is going to occur before the end of February, that is to say before March, although the quote odds or the numeric values we've got would seem to suggest it'll occur in 2009. I actually seem to think that if certain circumstances arise in late 2009, the Israeli mistake may not show up based on something we've got in MOM, but we're just going to have to see. It'll be a kind of a tense time into December. The curious part that I'm seeing now, though, is that some of the mainstream publications are now saying, that I've actually seen headlines, Israel will attack Iran before March. So some of those things were saying that kind of language in a vague sense. They weren't giving dates, but they were saying, the Israeli attack is basically on, that the Iranians need to be taught a lesson, blah, 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 blah. And this, in late last year, they were saying that we would see it in 2009. Now some of those same publications are holding out this March view. So I don't know if we're dealing with a psyop to, at any of the various different levels that could be implied, or if in fact there's something that is starting to push the pressure back. But here's the one thing that I do know at the moment.
Okay.
That they won't release the Israelis or allow the Israelis to attack Iran as long as there is some need or hope on the part of the political minions and the powers that be for the existing economic system. In other words, they know that an Israeli attack on Iran finishes everything.
Yeah.
AIG is shot, banks fold, $300 oil overnight, and you can just imagine all the consequences, and it just goes on and on and on. So until we actually have an economic collapse that gets to the point where the powers that be just don't care, the Israelis are on hold. This would imply, then we should imply or infer that if indeed the dollar collapse would be slow enough, it might actually have a tendency to push the Israelis out to a point where they might not be in a position to attack when they finally decided that they wanted to do so.
Mm-hmm. Hey,
now, I say one of our issues is that we get language forecasts. We don't actually get a picture of the event. We don't get movies of the event. We get a bunch of words in a giant mass that appear to be, a forecast of the words that will be used after the events. So our words relative to the Israeli mistake might show up 6 or 8 months from now if we had a whole series of articles coming out during the revolutionary phase about how close we did come to joining with the Israelis in an attack on Iran. So the jury is still out. We will see the language, but as to what the event will be that will cause it, at this point, I don't have any clearer vision of that. We might get something when we start the next run going here for the December report, but I bet you that we should all be able to see it, regardless of my report, before the end of the year anyway.
Sorry about that. I just had a phone call. Hey, Clif.
That's right.
I'm going to throw out a few keywords here that are coming in through the questions.
Sure.
And see what you can make of that. One of them is December context change, ill winds, Obama UFO disclosure.
Yeah, I don't know about the Obama disclosure. I've always assumed, and this is an assumption on my part, so it'll probably come back and bite me in the ass, but I've always assumed that disclosure would have such a huge emotional impact that it would be a giant tipping point, and thus would show up in our data as just that, a giant tipping point. Yeah. Now, it's true we've got some of those for 2011, but it's also true that we see the alien wars showing up before then, so I don't know that I don't have anything in my data that would suggest that Obama's going to do disclosure in the rest of 2009 or even up until March or April of 2010. Okay. It may show up then, but and it could actually be hidden then, in the sense that Obama could, according to the way we see our data shaping up, he could come out next March and get on TV and say, yes, here's all these space aliens, and contact is real. And it won't matter much because we'll be in the midst of active revolution and there won't be a whole lot of people paying attention. Okay. Plus, there's one other thing going against that.
What's that?
And that is that Obama hasn't got the security clearance to find out about these guys.
Well, this is true. We know there's how many levels above the president?
At least 27.
Wow. And
there may be more.
Ill winds. Unruly Julie is really wanting to know about ill winds.
Those were the last, when we did this last run, they were still building. There will be at least an 18-week period of time in which the ill winds will be a source of concern for a largish percent of the populace. It does seem to be tied to the Israeli mistake. We can see some interpretation that would suggest that the ill winds will be active in spite of the Israeli mistake. At least one of the episodes of the ill winds will be in the January, February, and probably from, say, the 22nd of January all through February and maybe into the early part of March of next year. I suspect that one is related to the onset of the more lethal form of the swine flu. But I don't know for sure. It's like I say, it's all tied up with the Israeli mistake. But the Israeli mistake does not eliminate the ill winds. It just seems to contribute to them. So in other words, we have ill winds relative to the swine flu. We have ill winds relative to the powers that be in their attempt for population control. And then we have the ill winds related to the Israeli mistake. The Israeli mistake does not eliminate the other two sources of that same set of archetypes.
Okay. And also, a couple other topics I'd like to touch on. Unruly Julie says thank you, by the way.
Oh, sure. I love that name. That's great. Yeah.
That's
Unruly
awesome.
Julie, yes.
Nibiru is one subject. The December context change is another subject. And
yeah, okay. Let's just deal with those two right at the moment. The Nibiru thing, there is some support for near-Earth objects giving us some problem, but I don't have anything in my data to suggest that is anything more, that the Nibiru, or Giant Planet X, or Nemesis, is anything more than a tool being used by the powers that be to generate fear and also segregate populace. In other words, they can actually say, and they have and are doing, they're creating memes and saying, how many people can we get to buy into this? What will it take to flesh this out to the point where we can get it to be a self-sustaining community that would then go off and burn energy doing this other stuff? The military does that kind of thing now, and they're paying people to generate these kinds of situations online. So, but our data shows the Nibiru or Planet X or let me just shade it all the way over to near-Earth orbiting objects or passing objects. And we do have some small amount, a little tiny bit of support for it being a reality in the future in the sense of a flyby that causes some problems, but we don't have anything to support the idea of a giant planet filled with, huge Anunnakis or whatever the hell live there, coming to cause us problems. It just doesn't show up. It only goes so far and it stops. And it's kind of, it's one of those things where we can actually see some memering going on some of these other threads. Now, this idea of Nibiru is not like that in the sense that we can't trace it back to a government op somewhere or a government set of IP addresses as the way we can with some of the memering, but it does seem to go back to basically a single sole source, which is the, ultimately it originates and goes back to the Sitchin writings. And because of that, there's no other historical support within our data to give us a broader archetype. The archetype, instead of broadening out in a pyramid fashion, goes down a couple of layers in a widening pyramid and then starts narrowing, and so thus becomes this sort of diamond shaped. And so those are the kind of things where we know we're dealing with or we suspect we're dealing with disinformation, where it doesn't have that broader base pyramid support of archetypes underneath it.
Okay.
Now, on the other side, the context change in the 29th, we should be able to give you a better idea of what words will be associated with that in the early December run.
Okay.
Right at the moment, we kind of think that, well, let me put it this way. The context change is an aggregation of a lot of different emotional sums that seem to focus in on one broad archetype under which, acting as an umbrella, a larger number of similar subjects are housed. So in other words, the last time we had a context change, the context change at the largest level, the highest level of the archetype, was immigration. One step down from that was undocumented worker or illegal immigration. And so our context changed because all of a sudden that was what was in the mainstream, and it became a major thread. We had all different kinds of demonstrations of the emotional power of that, and it changed the context in a rather short period of time of, say, less than a month. And it started on a particular day. This time our context change is clearly involving the dollar. And so it might be that on December 29th, the federal government would go ahead and say declare bankruptcy. And in that case, they wouldn't send out Social Security checks or any other entitlement, and we might even have the Constitution officially suspended while the government tries to work out its issues of not being bankrupt anymore. That kind of a context change would be what we call a sole point source context shift, whereas the immigration came from all over the place, even though it was sort of controlled and even though it was sort of leaked out and managed. Nonetheless, it arose in multiple different places, more or less all at once. The context change for the 29th of December seems to support the idea that it will be from the top down, so to speak, or will go through society that way, as opposed to coming from the bottom up, the way we saw with the mass marches of the undocumented workers, etc.
Okay.
Okay, so what wouldn't surprise me to see, for the context change, to see any number of strange things occur, but they're all going to be related to human kind of activity. In other words, context changes are not usually, in fact, in our history, have never been associated in our work with anything like natural disasters or any of that. Those show up under a different kind of situation.
Okay. And also, I just wanted to let everybody out there in the chat know I'm trying to monitor the questions here so we can get to them. I like what you're doing where you just put it in bold every once in a while. That way I can kind of keep an eye on it. But also, just so you know, this is actually Light Essence 37 from YouTube. I'm not Trevor. This is not the normal host. He's kind of been missing for a while, so I'm just kind of doing an improv stand-in here. So I hope you all bear with me. I'm trying to do my best for you.
Very well done, Dave. We appreciate it.
And Magnetosphere, Clif, is a... I need to get to that one. There's Polly's Customs is really adamant about getting to that.
Yeah, the magnetosphere is very troubling.